Okay, hi everybody, welcome back. Before we get going with our afternoon session, I wanted to say a few more things. So this event is hosted by the Natural and Artificial Minds Initiative here at Princeton, which is a diverse intelligences hub through the AI Lab. So you have seen some of our AI Lab staff around. So we have Susan and Ellen and Christine in here. And outside, Gina and Athena's in the back here running everything. So if you have questions, need help, they're a team that can be here to help you, and we're very grateful to them for the effort they're putting in here. The Diverse Intelligences events and program have been supported by the Templeton World Charity Foundation. So Virginia is here from Templeton. Sorry? Oh yeah, and Lee. All right, so you can talk to them about all of your Templeton World Charity Foundation questions. And then this year, the John Templeton Foundation is starting new programs focused around intelligence. Oh, here we go. And so so the session on Wednesday you'll be hearing more about that program, but we want to introduce, did you want to say anything quickly about?
Sure. So we are launching our online funding inquiry period. It actually closes on July 15th. So this is an opportunity to submit ideas related to our 2026 priorities. This is for the life sciences area. We have an interest in emerging properties like agency, consciousness, and intelligence. And foundation-wide, we have an intelligence venture. So you hear more about it on Wednesday from Amazon. And you can also check out our website between now and then and just talk to us. And we're happy to share more.
Great. So Stephanie and Emma will be here if you have questions about that for the next couple of days. All right, so Tanya Lombroso is going to be our chair for the afternoon, so I'll hand it over to her.
Hi, welcome everybody. Thanks for making it in after lunch and with such nice weather. My name is Tanya Lombroso. I'm one of the directors of Natural and Artificial Minds here, and it is my pleasure to get to introduce our next speaker, Daphna Buchsbaum. Daphna is an associate professor of cognitive and psychological sciences at Brown University, and there she directs two different lab groups, the Computational Cognitive Development Lab and also the Brown Dog Lab. And her work really looks at behavioral and computational approaches to intelligent learners of all kinds, whether that is humans, non-human animals like dogs, children, and so on. And one of the things that I think is really exciting about Daphna's approach to these questions, and that I think is very much in keeping with the spirit of both natural and artificial minds and diverse intelligences, is the range of methodological skills and insights she brings to the kinds of questions she asks. And I think this is reflected in her background. So her undergraduate degree from Brown was in human biology. She then got not one master's degree, not two master's degrees, but three master's degrees.
No, just two.
Was it two? Oh, because you didn't get the one on the way to the PhD. Okay, all right, sorry. There was a media lab PhD, master's degree. Then at Berkeley, where she did her PhD in psychology, she also got a master's degree in statistics. So I apologize for misattributing to you also a master's in psychology. It was only a PhD in psychology. And really, I think you will see, I think in what she's presenting today, the exciting way she brings this together to ask really broad questions about the nature of intelligence. So please join me in welcoming Daphna.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here. That was a really kind introduction, and I'm really excited to be here. So today I'm going to be talking about human-dog partnerships as a way to think about shared intentionality and joint attention across different kinds of minds. And in this talk, I'm going to focus mostly on dogs and also on children, but I'm also going to, at the end, connect this back to thinking about AI and robotics, because I think if we want artificial systems that are able to collaborate naturally with people in real physical environments, then dogs give us an unusually rich model of that kind of human, non-human coordination. Okay. A task I think you all, or many of you have encountered, which might be putting together a piece of furniture as a kind of physical problem-solving activity. And this might be challenging on your own, but it might be made easier by cooperating with another person. And so in this case, you and this other person might have a shared goal of completing the piece of furniture, but you also might have different divided roles, right? One of you might be taking on one part of the task relative to another. You might have partial information relative to each other, and you might communicate in a variety of ways, including language, but also gesture, gaze, and monitoring where each other are in the environment. And so one way that people have argued that humans have flexible and distinctive intelligence is in our ability to form these kinds of shared intentions with other people. In developmental psychology, this has often been connected to this idea of shared intentionality that I brought up, this ability to engage with others in collaboration, to have shared goals and common ground. And this is something that we see signatures of starting very early on, right? As early as 12 to 18 months of age. And on many accounts, this kind of collaborative engagement is seen as distinctive. And so here's maybe an example that's a little closer from a developmental psychology perspective, and that again you might have encountered. Maybe you have a goal of playing soccer together with your child. But within that shared goal, you may have different individual goals, right? And we take this behavior that we observe of you doing together as indicative of these internal mental states that we can't directly measure, right? That you have these shared goals and mutual awareness that's representative of this rich internal model. But we have to operationalize that somehow, right? And so one challenge in studying shared intentionality is that these intentions are hidden. And so empirically, we're often looking for signature behaviors, and those might be things like visual joint attention, right? Engaging together with the same object in the environment, maybe including some referential gaze. And that's taken as evidence for this kind of internal joint intention, or the emergence of that kind of intentionality. And this kind of visual engagement, shared visual engagement, has been used as this kind of measure in a variety of previous work with children. Another thing we might look at is gestures, right? So point following is often seen as this early emerging ability to let us direct the attention of our social partners, again, suggesting an understanding of our shared attention. Okay. So here I'm interested in whether these signatures of joint attention and shared intentionality that have been argued to be uniquely human, and at least by some accounts, although I think we may have some work from Chris's lab and others that might speak to these kinds of representations in apes. Often it's been argued that we don't have this kind of shared intentionality. I want to see whether they might also be present between humans and dogs. And dogs are particularly interesting comparison species because humans are natural social partners for dogs in a way that they aren't as much for many other animals. In many countries, pet dogs live in our homes. They're often raised in environments that overlap with the environments that children are raised in, and they have extensive experience interacting with humans and navigating a human physical environment. And we also know that they collaborate with people in both working roles, but also in a lot of naturalistic everyday interactions, right? That they can coordinate their behavior or even, say, recruit us to help them engage in a task like getting a tennis ball out from under a couch. And in fact, there's even interesting evidence that dogs, in some cases, coordinate their behavior with humans and collaborate with humans better than they do with other dogs. And finally, this also makes dogs relevant potentially beyond animal cognition, right? So if we want robots, as I mentioned, to collaborate with humans in natural environments, dogs already solve some of the same problems we want robots to solve, things like localizing objects, search and rescue. And so they might provide a really relevant model for how that kind of coordination can be done successfully between a human and a non-human. Okay. So I'm going to divide this talk roughly into 3 parts. So in the first part, I'm going to ask how dogs and also toddlers use human pointing gestures in a physical search task. Then I'm going to move to kind of a more naturalistic collaborative task, and where dogs and human partners need to sort of coordinate in a messy visual environment to find an object. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of ongoing and future work about how this can inform robotics, and also how some approaches in robotics can maybe help us gain question on big questions in animal cognition. Okay. So first, how do children and dogs use communicative gestures in physical search? And this and much of the other work I'm going to be talking about today is really work by Maddie Pelgrim, who until last week was a graduate student in my lab, but now she is off to a faculty position at Stonehill College. Okay, so pointing is this very salient, early emerging human communicative gesture that we can use to help direct attention starting in infancy. And humans aren't the only ones that are able to follow points. There are actually evidence in other animals as well, including elephants. But here I'm going to look at dogs who are pretty adept at following pointing gestures starting in puppyhood. They can also, like human children, follow points selectively. So they follow information from accurate pointers over inaccurate pointers, from knowledgeable pointers over ignorant pointers. But at the same time, no species, including human children and also human adults, is perfect at point following, because there's a lot of complicated and ambiguous information in points. And so here I want to see not just how toddlers and dogs follow points, but what kinds of cues within those points are they actually using, right? So a point is ambiguous. So even if you sort of understand the referential nature of a point, that the person or the agent communicating the point is trying to direct your attention, and they have an intent to do that to a particular place in the environment, there's still a variety of communicative ambiguity to resolve. So even if you have joint attention, this isn't necessarily trivial. So if there's a lot of different objects in the environment, it might not always be clear which one is being indicated. And so the problem of the kind of recipient here is to figure out, well, what does this person want me to choose? And there are a variety of different kind of possibilities here, right? So one possibility is you could follow a combination of gaze and the wrist or the finger in the direction, and that might bring you, for instance, in this example, to this chair. But you could also follow other aspects of, the sort of overall orientation of the face to the finger. Maybe you're looking more at the arm, maybe the lower arm. That would bring you up here, right, in this scenario. Or what if you're focused primarily on gaze, right? And so this actually kind of set of ambiguity came to us in part, I'll come back to this, from some colleagues in robotics who came to us and said, we want our robots to follow points. So which one of these vectors do people use? And we said, there are also other possibilities. So one possibility is that you see this more as a general directional signal. That could also be something that is either referential or just associative, or even just an indicator to like a side of the room or the body. And this has been difficult to evaluate in prior work, because almost all pointing tasks with kids and dogs have just used two alternative fourth choice, where the side of the room or the general direction is, conflated with the specific object. So here, I'm not going to do something yet quite as complicated as that image, but we've made it a little more complicated with 4 objects. And we had both toddlers and dogs observe an experimenter hide an object inside of 1 or 4 cups. And they were allowed to search exhaustively. And we were looking at following a point, and we were interested in what they do here. So this is still a pointing task, but there are multiple possibilities, and the cues kind of vary in their usefulness here. So here's what that looks like. This is with the dog. All right. And here is a toddler. Oh. All right, got it on the second try. Okay. So there's a couple things to note here. So despite that detour I just showed you, first, both dogs and toddlers are successful here. So chance would be 25%. They're both well above that. But you can also see that they're not at all at ceiling, either species. In contrast to some 2-cup tasks that have been done, right? So there's something more challenging here. Toddlers do somewhat better than dogs. I think they're around 55% and the dogs are around 40% here. So we can also think about some of those other cues I was talking about. So one thing we can look at is, well, what side of the room is their first choice on? And when we look at that, 2 interesting things happen. So first, the species difference disappears. And second, they're now doing quite well, right? So both dogs and toddlers are going to the side that's being pointed to first, but not always to the exact cup that's being pointed to. And so there's a couple things we can kind of think about here, right? So if you're seeing the point as leading to this, is referring to this one specific cup, then this is a bit puzzling. But as I mentioned, it could be that you see it as referring to this broader area. It could also be that you understand that it's pointing to a specific cup, but you're still learning which of these cues is relevant, right? So in some of these scenarios, depending which of these sort of vectors I was mentioning you're following, they might actually be referring to different points in space, right? So if you think that if you're primarily paying attention to the shoulder to the arm, that might actually be a bit different than the eye to the finger. Okay, so I'm going to come back to that. But another interesting difference here is in which cups they go to and which cups they go to when they're making an error. So what I'm showing here is the proportion of trials, first trials that each species goes to each of these cups. And what you can see is that dogs are biased towards the experimenter's position in addition to the side of the room that is being pointed to, right? So they're sort of attracted to the human, whether that's because they're using the body position as an additional source of information or they're checking in. That's an open question. Interestingly, that's not the case for the toddlers. So the toddlers, when they make errors, those errors aren't systematic. Okay, so just a quick interim summary here. The first takeaway is that both species can use human points in this more challenging 4 alternative search task. So they are picking out of the 4 cups the correct cup above chance. But it doesn't mean that the point is being interpreted exactly the same way as an adult human would, or as, between the 2 species. So I didn't show you these videos, but we did actually make adult humans do this, just to make sure that we hadn't set up an accidentally, ambiguous task. And adult humans are at ceiling. I don't know what happened in the 3% of trials, so we got it wrong. But this is so an adult human does see this consistently picking out the correct true cup. So something is happening both developmentally and comparatively here. Right, so it's possible that pointing at a young age may not be yet interpreted as richly in terms of shared intentionality as has been attributed. I guess I didn't say this. These kids are, I believe, 18 to 27 months. So they're at an age where they should be, where traditionally that kind of intentionality and rich understanding of pointing is attributed to them. And the species may be weighting different factors when solving this problem, things like the location and proximity of the pointer. So some ongoing work to kind of explore this further is we're actually integrating trajectory information so we can use our room cameras to track where the dog and human are in the environment and also to extract pose data. So here we have an example of a trajectory. And what you can do, there's a bunch of things you can do with this, but one of the things we're doing is looking at how efficient or inefficient is the route they take to their first target. Right, and so you can do that by sort of a number of different ways, but by averaging over distance or looking at maximum distance. And what we find is a couple things. So first, interestingly, both species make a first correct choice more efficiently than an incorrect choice. So this is just the first one they go to, right? And so it's not because they stopped at another cup on the way. And so maybe that suggests that, there is more indecision or other information or goals playing into the incorrect choices. Dogs, in general, use a more optimal approach path than toddlers. And again, they're more optimal when they're going to the cups closest to the person. So even when they make a successful choice to the outer cups, they often tend to do a drive-by. I think I have time for this. This is mostly for entertainment value, but as I mentioned, toddlers have sometimes quite variable approaches. I'm just gonna do a little trip to the back of the room. And there we go. Okay. And so another thing we're looking at is, that's not where I'm supposed to be. Here we go. Is adding in eye tracking for both species to look at how they're evaluating these cues, right? So are they looking at the head and the arm and the body, and is both where they look and the timing of those looks predicting their approach and their success? So here's just a little example of that with a toddler. And this is being done by our great honor student, Toby Portnow. So you can see a nice referential look there. There we go. Okay. So I wanted to come back here to this question of what are the cues being produced? And so this is work with our collaborators in the computer science department at Brown, Ivy He and Stephanie Telex, who are really interested in getting their spot robots to follow points. And so we wanted to understand when people point naturalistically, which of these cues is best aligning with their intended target. So which one is sort of the communicator using, which one best reflects what they're doing. And so in this case, what we did is we actually had dog owners come in. So in the previous study, we had an experimenter who was sort of executing very regimented points. But here we had dog owners come in and point for their dogs however they wanted to. So we just told them which cup to point to, and we just said, get your dog, use whatever point you think is best. And then we looked at the cues produced by that point. So first, and this again is very much ongoing work, so this is from some pilot data, but the points produced in this case are much more variable. So people pointing on their own do a lot more leaning. They don't do a lot of cross-body points, but they do some, I think about 20%. So people usually switch sides, but they will sometimes go like that. And in general, we found that the eye to the wrist performs best. As a side note, I keep saying wrist. I know that there's a lot of literature on the importance of like the pointer finger. We couldn't detect that with our cameras reliably enough. Ivy actually did a bunch of work sort of showing how much of a difference the finger versus the wrist makes. This technology is improving so fast that I'm guessing we may be able to go back and get fingers at some point soon. But that's why I keep saying nose to wrist and eye to wrist. And so here's what you can see there. So what you're seeing here, the X's is where the targets actually were. The big circles are centroids inferred from the point. And then the dots are individual points. So you can see that for the eye to wrist, that gives us, relatively well localized and spread out centroids, right? It's sort of clearly differentiating the possible targets. You can see that there's a slight bias here. To the right. We think that's partly because people are right-handed and partly possibly just the camera angles in the room. And you can contrast that to some of the other body-based vectors. So this one is elbow to wrist, so it doesn't include gaze. And you can see that the locations in space are a little less differentiated and that the individual points are more dispersed. And in particular, for instance, just gaze alone is quite a poor referent and does not well distinguish these targets. So kind of the good news here is that many of these body-based vectors, but particularly the eye to the wrist, are highly accurate to human intent. They clearly, right, so there's a signal there from the pointer. The puzzle is still that the dogs and the toddlers are only 40%, the dogs are 40% correct and the toddlers are 55% correct on their first try. And so they aren't just reading that geometric vector. And it's also not the case that we haven't fully looked at all the possible combinations, but it's not that gaze, for instance, or one of these alternatives will predict them, right? So what we're doing now is we want to move to a richer setup that has more height and depth information that can better differentiate these cues. So things like this that are going to work to further differentiate these vectors, where many of the times it makes more of a difference if they're more separated in all 3 dimensions. Okay. So I've gone through this kind of initial, limited, more experimentally constrained multi-search process. But here I now want to talk about, so that was this relatively brief communicative cue. And here I want to talk about this more naturalistic search task. So what happens when you have a human and a dog work together to find an object in a search that unfolds over time. This is, again, a project with Maddie Pelgrim. She also likes to refer to this as the tennis ball under the couch problem, right? So how do you search for and retrieve an object together successfully? And, when human-dog dyads work together in this kind of task, do they show the same kind of visual signatures of cooperation that we see with parents and children, for instance? Okay. Right, so we designed this task where dogs and owners sometimes have different information and different ways to access a reward. And then when we asked if they would coordinate their attention while searching. So we're interested in how do people and dogs work together on this task? How do dogs recruit their owners to help them find hidden treats? How do owners direct dogs to help them find hidden treats? And do we see instances of these sort of, human unique or supposedly human unique visual behaviors, particularly shared visual attention to objects? Oop. There we go. Okay, so I mentioned a little bit earlier, but for this study, we're using head-mounted eye tracking in the dogs and toddlers. So this is a system we've been using in our lab that we developed with Positive Science, and I think now some other labs are using it as well. And it lets us ask kind of what dogs are visually attending to as they move through the real world environment. And we kind of have previously done some work showing that this can capture their visual attention in real world contexts, like on a walk. And so here we're going to use it in this search. So this is what the task looks like. This is a schematic of the experiment room, which we've set up to have lots of possible hiding places, some of which are dog accessible and some of which are dog inaccessible. And then we had 3 kinds of trials. We had guardian or owner-led trials, and the idea here is that the treat is hidden somewhere the dog can access, but they don't get to see it hidden, only the owner gets to see it hidden, and the owner has to direct them to find it. Then we have dog-led trials. So in dog-led trials, the dog sees the item hidden, but it's hidden in a dog inaccessible location, so they must recruit their owner to help them get the reward. In control trials, it's the dog sees the treat hidden in a dog accessible location. So here we're just, trying to have this as a baseline of, you might worry that maybe dogs just love gazing at their owners regardless of what's happening, and it's not really about recruiting them into joint attention or to help them solve this task. So basically here we want to see, do they still engage in these same behaviors even when they don't need the owner's help? Okay, so we use this dual eye tracking approach where the owner and the dog both wear their eye trackers while doing the task. We kind of modeled this on some earlier tasks that have been done looking at the time course of interactions with toddlers. And so the task looks like this. So Here is an example of an owner-led trial. So the owner has previously seen that the treat is hidden under here. This one I think goes quite quickly because it's right near there, but we counterbalance locations all over the room. And here is a dog-led trial. Sorry, it is not, there we go. It was not showing me the same thing as you. So here the treat is hidden in this it's like, I think it's a shoe organizer up high. So the dog sees it hidden there, but they cannot reach it. And so they have to recruit their owner to retrieve it. I should say this was within subjects, so all of them did all three kinds of trials. Okay. And then this is just what this looks like on the two eye trackers. So here, this is an owner-led trial. So you can see the owner here is looking at the dog, and the dog is looking at Maddie and Carly. Now they're ready to go. Okay. All right. So what does visual coordination in this task look like? So first we had 13, I think we may be up to 16 now, but pairs that generated about, slightly less than 10,000 fixations. So a fixation, I believe here is like 100 milliseconds or more of looking at a given target. And each fixation was coded as falling into one of 17 search locations. So those are all the different hiding locations and distractors in the room, as well as at the partner or off target. And so that gives us sort of, this is a caricature, but something like this where we have two synchronized time streams of where the owner and the dog are looking in time. And we can look for things like mutual gaze, right? So time periods where they're both gazing at each other. Joint attention, so periods where they are attending to the same object and often looking back and forth between the object and their partner. We can also look at things like which of them led the interaction. So for instance, in this case of mutual gaze, the dog looked at the owner first and then the owner started looking back. Okay, so first, dyads were generally very successful at this task. This is what we expected, so we designed it with the expectation that they would mostly succeed, and that's what happened. So they had 2 minutes to search the room, and almost all of them found the treat during that time. They were slightly more successful in owner-led trials than dog-led trials, and those also were a little bit faster, but still very successful overall. And that means that, we sort of have enough success that what we can look at is, do these signatures of visual behavior predict how quickly they succeed in a given trial? Here, let me do this. Okay, so first, we did see mutual gaze and joint attention. Both of these occurred in all dyads and in the majority of trials. And that was true for both dog-led and owner-led instances. And it occurred basically almost never in the control trials. So there was only one mutual gaze instance over the entire set of control trials, and only 10 instances of joint attention. And so this is sort of showing kind of the distribution of those. So you can see that there's very high instances of both. There's somewhat more dog-led joint attention, where the dog initiates the interaction actually than human-led joint attention. Interestingly, that was again true even on the owner-led trials. So even when the human is the one that has the information about where the treat is. But there are still significant amounts of human-led joint attention. And we can also say, in addition to comparing this to the control condition, we can look at, how likely this would be just to occur, by various definitions of chance. So one of the ones we use that's taken again from some of the infant work is if you take the real data and you basically shuffle it, so you have the same fixations but in random order, how often does joint attention and mutual gaze happen in that case? So this is just an example. But we can do that here, and we can see that it's much less often, right? So it's not, again, just that this is where the attention is tending to go in the room. Okay. So we can also look at the impact of joint attention and mutual gaze on the time to success. Right, so here, faster, which is down, is better. And so we're looking on the x-axis at the proportion of the fixations in a trial that are in mutual gaze, kind of divided by different amounts of joint attention. So this is the proportion of the trial in joint attention. And so you might think that if joint attention is facilitating task performance because it's helping you coordinate with the other agent and also suggestive of sort of your shared goals, then having a higher proportion in joint attention will make you faster than a lower proportion. And that actually is what we find. But you might also think that that could be modulated by mutual gaze. So maybe looking at each other to check in is also going to facilitate faster performance at different levels of joint attention. And what we actually find is a little more nuanced. So there is an interaction. So what we see is that mutual gaze at average amounts of joint attention leads to faster success. And joint attention at average amounts of mutual gaze leads to faster success. But you can have too much of a good thing. So if you have a lot of mutual gaze and a lot of joint attention, then you start slowing down. We still have to look into this more, but sort of anecdotally, one thought we have is that this can be suggestive of misdirection or confusion, right? So you're checking in and spending a lot of time in these because you're not sure what's happening, or you're both spending a lot of time looking together at the wrong objects because you have become confused, right? So it's more, if you have a little of each, that's the right amount, at least in this task here. And that was, again, true across both trial types, meaning when the dog-led and the owner-led trials. So I'm not going to talk too much about this, but it's kind of next step that we're really excited about is taking the same kind of collaborative search setup to a working dog environment. So that is me a very long time ago. In a previous life, I was actually a canine search and rescue handler with the California Rescue Dog Association. And so we've actually been just starting to work with them to see if we can do this kind of same kind of time course of collaborative interaction with search and rescue dogs. Okay. All right, but so the main result we have from this task is that these human-dog dyads show the same kinds of at least visual signatures of coordination that we often look for in studies of joint attention in humans and in children. So we see mutual gaze and we see shared attention to objects in the environment. And these behaviors occur across all of the dyads we tested, and both the dogs and the humans initiate them. And they do seem to be related to how, right, like the pattern of this behavior seems to be related to how quickly the dyads succeed. Right, so, I don't think I can infer from this that dogs have this rich representation of shared intentionality. That could still be unique to humans. But it seems like these behavioral signatures aren't, right? And so if it is unique, then we maybe need to understand some more about, are these precursors, about sort of what the continuum here is. Just some ongoing work in this area is also integrating auditory cues. Interestingly, when we did piloting, we saw a lot of both humans and dogs vocalizing in addition to using body orientation and gestures. In our actual dyads, we didn't have the dogs vocalize very much. I think there's a lot of individual differences there, but I think it could still be quite rich from both ends. And also looking at trajectory and gestures in the way I mentioned for pointing in the context of this task, I think could be really informative. Okay. So I kind of said this, but we have this behavior in children and in children that we think is indicative of this rich internal representation. We have this kind of behavior in dogs, but we still have this question of what does that indicate internally. And I think there's sort of this quote, I think from Louis Leakey about tool use, when we thought tool use was completely human unique, that following results from Jane Goodall, he said, well now, showing tool use in chimpanzees, he said that now we must redefine tool, redefine man, or accept chimpanzees as human. So I think, I'm not saying we accept dogs as human, but I think we want to think about what are these social representations and how do they manifest in our behavior. And so in this last little bit, I wanted to come back to this direction I foregrounded way in the beginning, which is robotics, and looking at human-dog collaboration as a sort of rich example for human, non-human collaboration more generally, and for robotic collaboration in particular. Okay. And so this, again, is work with Ivy Head and Stephanie Telex. And the kind of robotics version of this problem is, can we build robots that collaborate with people more like dogs do, right? That are able to read the human gesture and positioning and situation, and not just wait for explicit instructions, right? And so when robots collaborate on something like an object search task, often this is done with explicit verbal input. And our kind of hypothesis here is that this kind of collaborative search may be learnable from real human-dog interaction, like from the kind of video and features we've been recording, and that you might actually be able to train the robot in a way that both is more efficient and more interpretable to human in this way. This is kind of a very high-level overview of the pipeline, and this is very much Ivy's work that I'm going to try and capture here. But it's roughly that we start with video of human-dog interaction in something like our pointing task or our object search task, and then we extract a structured representation from that of the human, the dog, and the scene, right? So the relative pose of the human and the dog, where they are in the environment, where the objects are. And then we reconstruct that interaction in a simulation, and then we use that to train a robot policy. And so this is sort of an example of that data here. You can see that this looks very sort of similar to what I was showing you for our empirical tasks, right? So this is one trajectory in the pointing task, where you can see the movements and choices of the dog. And this is sort of the time course of the dog's attention over that interaction. And then here is a task demo. So this is very hot off the presses simulation, which is why Spot has a VHS recorder for a head. Actually, let me show you this one as well. This is, I think, done in Unity, but the idea is that this is showing one of the baselines that's just going to the nearest cup relative to what that dog did in the same, on that same trial. But the idea here is that, these are preliminary results, but they're encouraging. So the idea here is that we compared a variety of kind of simple, explicit baselines to different learned policies. So that's things like go to the nearest cup, just go to where the last seen point went. And we compared those to a couple of different models that, the key thing they share is that some kind of representation of the time course of the recent interaction, right? So they're actually having some temporal state. And they're also maintaining not just the sort of target destination, but the attention of the dog. And we're actually evaluating on both of those metrics, right? So task success, like does the robot succeed in getting the correct object, but also attention accuracy, right? So if as the robot predicts where it should look next in the scene, how well does that attention align to where the dog was allocating their attention? And basically what we see is that having that kind of representation of the sort of temporal trajectory of both the state and attention is relevant to task performance, right? So models that have that are, at least in this is in the 4-cup task, or a version of the 4-cup task, are being much more successful at going to the correct target. And that's also true for attention, but you can see that there's a gap here, right? And so attention isn't, fully explained by this model, and also task success is maybe not fully explained by attention. And so there's still some room for capturing other aspects of what the dog is intending to and why in the environment to improve this interaction. Okay. Right, so in this controlled 4-cup setting, the policies that are trained on human dog data seem like they outperform these simpler baselines that are just looking at things like the cues from the human. And we want to extend this to more realistic object search spaces, like the kind I had in the collaborative search task. And also model when the robot should attend to the partner versus the world over time in more of a time course or sequential way rather than just a frame-by-frame way. And again, the long-term goal is a robot that collaborates with a human the way that a dog does. Okay, perfect. And so that idea of using human-dog interaction as a model for human and robot interaction is maybe an example of a broader idea, which is children and non-human animals as models for flexible embodied intelligence. Right, and the idea here that I think a lot of people spoke to this morning already is that to solve a physical task in the real world, in a real body, you may need to represent a lot of things. You may need to represent object properties and affordances, causal relationships, other agents, cues or knowledge, uncertainty, how to operate your body and motor actions in the real world. And there's, and I'm actually part of this ONR Muri grant that's sort of predicated on this hypothesis that truly flexible problem solving can only be achieved by a robot that does some of these things, that devises, adapts, and exploits structured representations of tasks, and that, the kind of representations that allow things like metacognition about cognitive control, for instance. But actually for this audience, I wanted to pose a problem with this. And it's a problem where I think where robotics can help us speak back to animal cognition, right? And so the problem is that this exact question of whether you even need structured abstract representations to do any of this is one of the biggest questions in animal cognition, right? And so, on the one hand, my collaborators in robotics are saying, well, we can only do this if we have these structured representations like animals and children have. And on the other hand, we're saying, well, do animals and maybe even children even have those? And so I think that this debate in animal cognition of do we need these structured, rich, abstract representations of things like objects and causes and tools and agents and goals, or could simpler learning mechanisms, for instance, things based on heuristics or reinforcement learning, explain this behavior, speaks to this problem in robotics, but it's also something where maybe some of the approaches in robotics can help us gain traction on that problem, right? So often we talk about, how many of you have heard of Morgan's canon? In this room, I'm genuinely unsure. Okay, a lot, but not everyone. So what I found is that in animal cognition, this is more or less the word of God, and that in a lot of areas, like none of the roboticists I talked to had ever heard of it. So I thought I'd put it out here because it's this idea that, in no case, this is Lord Lloyd Morgan, and he had this rule, which is, in no case may we interpret an action as the outcome of the exercise of a higher psychical faculty if it can be interpreted as the outcome of the exercise of one which stands lower in the psychological scale. And this is often interpreted as sort of explanations in terms of general, widely available learning processes, which we often think of as reinforcement learning, or in maybe more of a robotics context as model-free, should be preferred as explanations over model-based or world model explanations. And so some work we're just starting with George Kanidaris is sort of trying to really take a look at that. So one direction we're exploring is to take classic tasks that are used to study things like problem solving and tool use and abstraction in children and animals and formalize them as robotic benchmarks. So George likes to call these his North Star robotics tasks. And the idea is that we can select these tasks that we think a smart system capable of flexible problem solving in real world physical environments should be able to solve. And then we want to kind of formalize them and look at the actual sort of stimuli, actions, training histories, plausible trial budgets, right? Like how much time are you giving it to learn this? And compare different current models in robotics on how they succeed across these tasks, right? So compare different model-free learning approaches, approaches with pre-trained trials, maybe taken, for instance, from video data of tasks, world models, and hybrid approaches, and evaluate which ones succeed, but also things like their sample efficiency, their generalization, and where they fail. And the idea is that while maybe, you know, we always have this tension that if you don't fix the representation or the algorithm, then some combination can learn anything. They may not learn it in a reasonable amount of time, for instance. And that may be something that can speak back to this debate in animal cognition, right? That we may find, right? And so I think our prediction was that many of these tasks will, in the end, to be learned in like not millions and millions of trials for each one, will require some kind of world model that supports planning and simulation and counterfactual reasoning. But the whole thing is that, you know, it's designed to test that, right? We could be wrong. It could be that much like we thought that language couldn't be learned from just downloading enough data, will turn out to be wrong for these kinds of tasks. But I'm hoping that this can sort of be a way that animal cognition can learn from robotic comparisons. Okay. So I'll end kind of with wrapping up these three broad points. So in the first part of the talk, I pointed out that many behavioral signatures of joint attention and as well as point following extend beyond humans. And so, you know, our question now is, does this similar behavior represent different representations? Or especially given that toddlers are also not at ceiling on many of these tasks, are they sort of a shared representation that we have? Second, human-dog interaction can maybe inspire more natural and efficient human-robot collaboration. It's one of the primary examples we have in the real world of humans and non-humans successfully collaborating. We are actually working with some people who are also interested in human-horse interaction. One thing that's an interesting model for is autonomous vehicles, actually, and shared control in an autonomous vehicle situation. And I wanted to kind of put out this idea of, you know, robotics helping to make different animal cognition hypotheses potentially more explicit or tractable. All right, thank you. I also wanted to thank all of our collaborators, especially Maddie Pelgrim and the other students in my lab who assisted with this project, and collaborators and our robotics collaborators, as well as our funders, and of course all of the many dogs and families who participated in this work. Thank you.
Lovely talk, really fascinating stuff. I wanted to ask you about your definition of joint attention. So obviously the Carpenter Tomasello definition emphasizes communication at the point of mutual gaze. And they might think of, you know, kind of overlap in attention towards one object as more like parallel attention rather than joint attention. And you said you have recorded communication as well. So if you were to add in like overlap or alternation between parallel attention and mutual gaze and look for instances of communication, that might be the kind of joint attention in the narrow sense that would be really, really interesting to see if there was any examples of that particular form of joint attention in the dog-human collaboration.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and we do want to look at that. I guess to your point, I think what I'd also be, I think we started looking at this, but I don't have the results off the top of my head, which is specifically the referential gaze, because for the dogs, they might vocalize, but they often, because they don't talk, obviously, are more constrained to be using their body. And so I think that might also, you know, we'd have to think a little bit how we operationalize communication at the point there. But I think that, yeah, to your point, that if you both happen to be looking at the same thing at the same time, how do you know
that thing.
Yeah. I guess, yeah. So I think that would be a really cool thing to add in. I guess the shuffling helps a little bit with the idea that it's not just that they're coincidentally looking at it, but in terms of like, are you now re-coordinating, looking at some of that either referential gaze or mutual gaze and then joint attention could also be helpful as well as vocalization. Oh gosh.
Hi. I have a question about, I'm the dog owner, so I observe my dog a lot, and I feel their understanding of the world is actually centered around olfactory system. So senses and smells carry a lot more information than just visual. I just wonder if you have any thoughts about how to make sense or
I'm glad
joint attention. Yeah, with that, mismatching the sensory system.
There's a lot of interesting things. I'm glad you brought that up because I had meant to speak to olfaction and I didn't. I want to answer that in two parts. So the first part is that maybe it's relevant to the second part, that dogs, when working with humans, it's been shown that they rely much more on their vision than otherwise. Whether that's, due to an awareness of our inability to smell things or just that we've structured things. So on these kind of tasks that they're doing with humans, like they have the olfactory capability to use their noses, but the evidence is that they don't often when they're partnering with humans. However, the other part of that is that there's some interesting new work that shows that dogs have a very integrated visual and olfactory representation of their environment. Like their visual areas in their brain basically also have high overlap with olfactory information, and so they sort of have an integrated olfactory visual representation where the eyes go, the nose go, and it may not be totally separated out. My final anecdote on that is to the first point, in search and rescue, where you are training them explicitly to use their noses, there's often an aha point, it seems like, for the dog, where they realize that they can still continue with the task even though they can no longer find the person visually. I should also add that we do control for olfactory cues in the tasks. So there's always false baiting to prevent them from using their nose in the tasks. But I think the broader question you're getting at of how do you accommodate the mismatch in your primary senses is really interesting. And could be one that very well applies to robots also, right? Like they're going to have maybe sensory abilities or physiologies that we don't have. Yeah. Oh.
Yeah, really cool work. I'm really interested in the collaborative search environments because it's there's so much going on in terms of the possibility of mental state monitoring in a task like that, where it's basically a kind of decentralized POMDP or something like that. I'm curious if you've been able to look at instances where the attention is carefully controlled. So where you looked at this a little bit with the mutual gaze, but where it's the subjects look at the object and look at each other, then look back at the object, and kind of building that some kind of representation of I see that you're watching me look at the thing and I'm watching you look at me. And so therefore we both are aware of the fact or have some kind of common knowledge of what we're representing about the task. You might have some information, I might have some, and we're able to share that through these kind of more sophisticated gaze dynamics. I'm just curious if there's anything like that in some of the mutual gaze data that you've been collecting.
It's something that we want to look at. So Stephanie's group has actually a kind of, I think they call it LEGS, it's language enabled gesture and object search, POMDP, that they use for the robot. And so that would be sort of in the step where we're doing the simulation. I think that would start to allow us to look at some of that time course stuff in a richer way, like you're suggesting, of, does the amount of uncertainty at a given place you are in the room, A, predict the kind of looking behaviors, and B, do those appear to resolve it? But we have not done that with this data yet. That's definitely something we're interested in. I'd be happy to talk about it more if you have ideas.
One final question.
The studies that you showed with pointing with dogs, were they all with a dog and the dog's owner? And does it matter if the person is the dog's owner or somebody the dog doesn't know?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that. So the first results with both dogs and toddlers were with an experimenter. That was for two reasons. It was to have the controlled points, but also it turned for the toddlers, no matter how much warm-up we did, we could not get them to sit with the experimenter and watch their parent pointing. That was a no-go. But for the later point production, that was by the owner. And we did also, I didn't talk about it, but we did also have them do the task. And performance was very similar, but there was one important difference, which is that dogs were consistently much more efficient following their owner's point. So, which we thought was really, really interesting, that right there, they've got, there's different ways you could look at that. Maybe they've just learned how their owner moves, but you could also think that they've learned how to coordinate with each other. So, that was using that path analysis. So they take significantly more efficient paths to their first choice target when their owner is the pointer.
All right, please join me in thanking Daphna.